So I want to begin by acknowledging the title and what it invokes. I chose this phrase before the current moment, but I'm delivering it in a world before and through this moment in which wars are not metaphorical. There are wars being waged right now, as we sit here, that are devastating landscapes and populations in ways that demand our attention and our grief. In Gaza, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Sudan, in the Congo, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in communities across the globe where the machinery of state violence and extractive capital is producing death at scales that overwhelm the capacity of language to describe. As I prepared these remarks, the United States and Israel are bombing Iran for a sixth week. A war on Lebanon has displaced a fifth of that country's population, and the Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's oil passes, has been closed, sending shockwaves through the global economy that will land, as they always do, on the people least able to absorb them. I do not want to aestheticize that violence by folding it into this argument that I'm making today, but I also do not want to pretend that the ground wars I am about to describe, the molecular, the vegetal, the entomological, are separate from the wars that are killing people and destroying the conditions for life in the places I've just named. They're not separate. The extractive logics I will trace today, the reduction of living ecologies to resources, the saturation of territory with chemicals designed to simplify and control, the treatment of certain populations and certain landscapes as expendable substrates for the production of wealth elsewhere, are the same logics that organize military occupation, that rationalize bombardment, that render entire peoples and their lands disposable. The ground wars of the plantation and the ground wars of the present share a common infrastructure, the infrastructure of extraction, of racial capitalism, of the conviction that some lives and some lands exist to be used up in the service of others. And I'm really resonating with, oh, we're not there yet, what Yolanda offered us a moment ago in conversation with Teresa about the sense of being at the service of colonial capital. And these wars are always already environmental crises, as you know. In early March, airstrikes on oil depots near Tehran sent massive plumes of toxic smoke over a city of 10 million people and produced what residents described as black rain, oily, acidic precipitation that left a dark film on rooftops, burned the skin, and sent the World Health Organization scrambling to issue respiratory health warnings. The Iranian Red Crescent warned that the rain could cause chemical burns and serious lung damage. A desalination plant on Qashem Island in the Persian Gulf supplying water to 30 villages was bombed. In Gaza, more than 80% of the tree cover has been destroyed. 50 million tons of debris laced with asbestos, heavy metals, and unexploded ordnance now compose the ground. And raw sewage flows into the Mediterranean at a rate of over 100,000 cubic meters a day because Israel has destroyed every one of Gaza's wastewater treatment plants and 70% of its sewage pumps. The soil is contaminated, the aquifer is contaminated, the air is contaminated. These are not side effects of war, they are war. War waged on the ground itself, on the conditions for biological life, on the substrate. And I want to hold that recognition as we proceed. So here we go. 2 weeks ago, a team of microbiologists at the University of Buenos Aires published a study in Frontiers in Microbiology that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. The study was about glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, the most widely used herbicide on the planet. Glyphosate is what makes industrial monoculture possible at its current scale. It is sprayed on soy fields in Argentina, on corn in the American Midwest, on cotton in India, on wheat in France. If you have eaten today, you have almost certainly eaten something that glyphosate touched. What the Buenos Aires team did was simple in design and devastating in implication. Sampling in the greater Buenos Aires region, they collected over 100 bacterial strains from 3 different sites. A protected wetland in the Paraná Delta, from local farmland where glyphosate had been applied for years, and from hospitals nearby. So they're getting bacteria from these 3 places. They tested each strain against 16 common antibiotics and against glyphosate itself. What they found was this. The most common multi-drug resistant bacteria from the hospitals, the strains that no longer respond to our drugs of last resort, were also highly resistant to glyphosate. And bacterial strains from the wetland, where glyphosate had never been applied directly, had nonetheless developed partial resistance to it, likely through exposure to contaminated runoff. So let me say this again because the finding is worth sitting with. A weed killer, a chemical designed to kill plants, is selecting for antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the soil. The bacteria that survive glyphosate exposure are the same bacteria, or close relatives of the same bacteria, that survive antibiotic treatment in hospitals. And they are moving between these two worlds, field and clinic, soil and body, through the water cycle, through untreated wastewater, and also through the ordinary circulations of a shared environment. Rupa Maria and Raj Patel anticipated this finding in their 2021 book, Inflamed, where they argued that Roundup, which functions as an antibiotic as well as an herbicide, was creating more harmful human pathogens in the soil. And the science, it seems, has caught up with their analysis. Now, I want to be precise about what this means and what it doesn't. It does not mean that glyphosate causes antibiotic resistance in any simple linear sense, but what it means is that the chemical regime of industrial agriculture, the suite of synthetic compounds that monoculture requires in order to function, is producing effects in the soil that exceed anything the regime was designed to manage. The plantation is generating its own undoing. Not deliberately, not as resistance in any intentional sense, but as a consequence of the biological fact that living systems under chemical pressure do not simply die, they adapt, they mutate. They become something the system did not predict and cannot control. Do read Vincent Adams's extraordinary book, Glyphosate in the Swirl, if you're interested in this particular chemical and its distribution. So today I'm going to ask you to move with me across scales in what might feel like a vertiginous fashion, from the microbial to the vegetal, and from the vegetal back to the question of extraction. Because what the glyphosate study reveals at the scale of the bacterium, I've been tracking at other scales for a long time now. In the contaminated soils of Martinique, where the organochlorine pesticide chlordecone persists centuries after its application, in the bodies of plantation workers who carry that chemical in their blood and tissue, and in the life of an insect, the banana borer weevil, whose stubborn refusal to be eradicated by the plantation's chemical arsenal has long struck me as a form of what I can only call terrestrial response. The soil remembers what we put in it, and the soil responds. Not with intention, not with consciousness as we conventionally understand it, but with the biological ingenuity of organisms that have been doing the work of survival for far longer than we have. Bacteria mutate. Weevils form themselves into sacrificial clusters that I'll talk about a little bit later. Plants push through contaminated ground, drawing toxins into their root systems and continuing against all odds to grow. These are not metaphors. They are material processes occurring beneath the threshold of human attention at temporal scales that the plantation's managers, and I will argue, the digital systems that increasingly govern extractive agriculture cannot apprehend. These are ground wars. Wars fought in the soil, at the molecular scale, between the chemical apparatus of the plantation and the organisms that refuse its terms. So what I want to propose today is that these subterranean processes constitute a form of terrestrial knowledge, a form of intelligence produced not by consciousness, but by the biological responses of organisms under chemical pressure. A perspective on extraction that starts not with the satellite image or the balance sheet, but with the ground itself, with the organisms that inhabit it, and with the forms of knowledge that emerge from sustained embodied attention to what the ground is doing. Ultimately, I think they urge us toward an embrace of vegetality, or glaciality. My brain was popping through the last few hours, though I'll need the rest of this talk to explain what I mean by that. So the argument I want to make today moves from extraction, if you need some signposts, to and through the plantation, into the digital age, and back to vegetality. And each builds on what came before, and by the end, I hope to have assembled something like a theory of what the ground knows and how it responds to unremitting violence. And I should say a word about where this formulation comes from, because it doesn't arrive from nowhere, and I don't want to pretend that it does. Where am I? From here. So I take my primary coordinates from our convener, Macarena Gomez Paris, whose 2017 book, The Extractive Zone, gave us what I consider the essential vocabulary for this conversation. Gomez-Badiz names two things that I want to hold together throughout this talk. The first is what she calls the extractive view, the colonial and capitalist gaze that renders living ecologies legible as resources awaiting removal. The extractive view sees a forest and perceives timber. It sees a river and perceives hydroelectric potential. It sees a mountain and perceives ore. It's a way of looking that converts the living world into raw material, and it is, Gomez-Badiz argues, inseparable from the racial and colonial logics that have organized that conversion since at least the 16th century. The extractive view is not neutral perception. It is a technology of power. It produces the territory it claims merely to observe. And the second thing Gomez-Badiz names is what she calls submerged perspectives, the ways of seeing, knowing, and being that refuse the extractive view's terms. Working with indigenous activists, artists, and communities across South America, she shows how people who inhabit extractive zones develop modes of perception and practice that the extractive view cannot capture. These are epistemological refusals, ways of knowing the territory that begin from below, from within, from the position of those whose lives are organized by extraction, but whose understanding of the world exceeds the extractive frame. And so my thinking about terrestrial knowledge builds on Gomez-Badiz's submerged perspectives, but presses into the soil itself, into the microbial and the vegetal and the entomological registers where, I want to argue, another way to resist the extractive view is being produced. I'm not the first to make this downward move. Catherine Yusuf's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None argues that geology is a racial category, as does Hadi Al-Asali's beautiful dissertation from 2019, 18, I can't remember anymore, and that the view from the stratum reveals the colonial violence that Anthropocene discourse typically obscures. Gabrielle Hecht has this wonderful concept of interscalar vehicles, where she proposes a methodology for moving through scales from below. I'm thinking about Christina Lyons's ethnographic work with soil scientists and campesino farmers in Colombia, where she develops what she calls soil thinking. And each of these scholars has taught me that looking down into the earth, into the body, into the molecular is not a retreat from politics, but instead is an intensification of it. And what I want to add is the specifically vegetal and entomological dimension, the argument that the organisms inhabiting the ground of the plantation are themselves producing a kind of knowledge, not discursive knowledge, but the biological knowledge of adaptation, of endurance, of response to chemical pressure that constitutes its own form of submerged perspective. So today I want to take Gomez-Badiz's framework and press it toward the plantation. The extractive zone, as she theorizes it, is organized around mineral extraction, and that work is indispensable as we continue to learn. The uranium and lithium working as kind of co-travelers is fascinating. But I want to argue that the plantation might very well be the extractive zone's origin story. Mining is ancient, right? You had copper at Timna, gold in Nubia, silver in Roman Iberia. These are things my archaeologist colleagues teach me. But the plantation was the first fully systematized technology of racialized extraction, the institution that developed the labor regimes, the ecological logics, and the commodity circuits that industrial mining would later inherit and extend. The sugar plantations of Madeira, Sao Tome, and then those of the Caribbean in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries were proto-industrial in their organization of forced labor, their rationalization of monoculture production, and their integration into transatlantic markets before the factory, before the industrial mine. And before there was an industrial mine, there was a cane field. So the foundational gesture of what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism was agricultural. And the submerged perspectives that Gomez-Badiz theorizes have their own parallel genealogy in plantation societies, a genealogy that runs through the provision ground, through maroon cultivation, through the ethnobotanical knowledge of enslaved people who developed sophisticated pharmacopoeias from the plants they grew in the interstices the plantation system left uncontrolled. Londa Schebinger has demonstrated how colonial botany operated as a form of extraction in its own right. The shipping of plant materials all over the world. You look at a botanical garden, and this is what we see, colonial botany. Systematically transferring plant knowledge from colonized peoples to metropolitan institutions, converting indigenous pharmacopoeias into European commodities. And Jennifer Anderson's work on mahogany does a similar kind of work, tracing the nonlinear routes that raw and crafted hardwood took from South America and the Caribbean to British and North American markets. The mahogany table in a Georgian dining room, like the sugar in a London teacup, arrived scrubbed of the conditions of its production. The processes by which constructions of taste and the production of new aesthetic regimes in the global north gave life to commodities derived from extractive agriculture, not incidental to the plantation's operation. They are its cultural infrastructure, the means by which extraction is laundered into refinement, violence into value. Sidney Mintz demonstrated that sugar could not be understood as a commodity alone, right? The cultivation of taste and the cultivation of a desire for sugar was important. Sylvia Wynter argued that in plantation societies, enslaved people, and I quote her, came into being as adjuncts to the product, to the single crop commodity. And Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, and their interlocutors have proposed the term Plantationocene to replace the Anthropocene. And what interests me in all of these formulations is the plant at the center of the system. So the plantation itself is named for the plant. Rebecca Altman has traced a stunning genealogy of this naming and, in her work on the petrochemical corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. She shows that the 100 or so petrochemical plants along the Mississippi were constructed on former cotton, indigo, and sugar plantations. So one example she offers is, where cotton was being grown, we now have chemical plants making rayon, right? That there's that shift happening there. And they now produce synthetic versions of the crops once raised by forced labor. The factory became the plant. The plantation became the plant. The word carries its history inside it. It is etymologically and materially a technology, and I'm talking about the plantation, organized around vegetal life. And yet in most critical accounts, the plant itself remains strangely inert, a backdrop against which the human drama of slavery, labor, and resistance unfolds. The sugar cane, the cotton boll, the banana, the tobacco leaf, the mahogany tree, these appear as commodities, as objects of labor, as economic units. They rarely appear as living organisms with their own temporalities, their own chemical processes, their own entanglements with the soils, insects, and microbes that constitute the plantation's ecology. The human suffering of the plantation has been extensively and rightly theorized. But what about the rest of the living world that the plantation reorganized? What about the plants themselves and the insects that eat them and the microbes that inhabit the soil they grow in and the chemical compounds that were deployed to manage them all? And this is where the vegetal enters. And I want to be clear about what I mean here because it's doing specific work for me that may not be immediately transparent. So by the vegetal, I do not simply mean plants, though plants are central. I mean something closer to a mode of being, a way of inhabiting time, space, and relation, organized by the logics of plant life rather than by the logics of animal mobility, cognitive speed, or productive efficiency. The vegetal names a temporality. It is slow, seasonal, cyclical, operating at rhythms often imperceptible to human attention. It names a spatial orientation, rooted, anchored to particular ground. And it names a form of agency radically different from what we usually recognize as such. Plants do not move through the world of their own accord, but they transform it through photosynthesis, through root networks, through chemical signaling, through the slow labor of converting mineral substrate into living tissue. The vegetal, in this sense, refuses one of the most enduring oppositions in Western thought, the division between the biological and the geological, the organic and the inorganic, the living and the inert. Plants are the hinge between these categories. Rooted in mineral ground, they convert the geological into the biological through processes that operate at the boundary of what we recognize as life. And in recent years, critical plant studies has begun to take these capacities seriously. Botanists have demonstrated that plants communicate through chemical signals. Some researchers have proposed the existence of plant intelligence. Michael Marder, for example, has argued that the vegetal has been systematically abjected in Western thought because it represents forms of life that threaten the primacy of the rational, autonomous subject, the subject, I would add, who stands at the center of the extractive view. But there's an older, I would argue, tradition of vegetal thinking that critical plant studies has been slow to reckon with. A tradition that emerges not from European phenomenology, but from the plantation itself. So in 1942, in Vichy-occupied Martinique, Suzanne Césaire published an essay in the journal Tropique called La malaise d'une civilisation, the malaise of a civilization. In it, she argues that the Martinican is fundamentally vegetal, an homme plant, a plant human who does not seek to dominate nature, but allows themselves to be possessed, moving along by the force of life. Okay, I'm aware of how this sounds. The eroticization and collapse of Caribbean people into Caribbean landscapes is a rightly surfaced critique. Around Césaire, André Breton described her as beautiful like a rum punch and likened her to a tide of frantic vegetation. Who describes a person in these terms? Fine. But Suzanne Césaire was not André Breton, right? As Annette Joseph Gabriel has shown in her work on Suzanne Césaire, Césaire developed her most subversive arguments through the arts of literary evasion required by her role interfacing with the Vichy World War II era occupying censors. What she was doing was refusing the ontology of the colonizer, the Cartesian subject who stands over and against nature, who masters it, who extracts from it. So the plante was a counter-ontological proposition, a way of being in the world that refused the extractive relation at its root. Monique Allawert's work on what she calls para-humanity in colonial plantation societies illuminates what was at stake for Césaire. Allawert shows that the plantation was an ecological system in which human and non-human bodies were made porous and permeable through the extractive process. Enslaved persons absorbed toxins, pathogens, and environmental forces that broke down the boundaries of liberal personhood. The plante in this light is not a romantic figure, but a precise description of a material condition, the condition of bodies that have been made vegetal by the plantation's chemical and ecological regime, and that might reclaim that vegetality as a resource for thinking otherwise. Suzanne Césaire was not alone. I've been tracing what I want to think of as a kind of Black plant tradition, beginning from Martinique, but extending out into African diasporas, wondering at the ways that botanical knowledge circulates and about what vegetality offers as an analytic for thinking about racialized and gendered life. For example, Zora Neale Hurston, writing 2 decades earlier than Césaire, described plants as ground thoughts, the thoughts of the soil itself, pushed into the world as blade of grass, as flower, as pine tree, because the ground can feel but cannot move. I think Hurston's formulation is extraordinary for what it refuses: the equation of freedom with mobility, of thinking with speed. For communities whose movements have been constrained by enslavement, by incarceration, by borders, Hurston's insistence that the ground itself is a site of thought is not romantic, it's a survival epistemology. And today, you see up here work by Martinican artist Sylvia Berthet, who extends this lineage. Berthet presents herself as plante mère, or plant mother, describing herself as half woman, half plant, and characterizing her work as territorial alchemy. So where Suzanne Césaire's plante emerged within masculinist, surrealist, and revolutionary discourse, Berthet's now centers a maternal and generative relationality. Her concept of territorial alchemy, the transformation of contaminated grounds into conditions for unexpected flourishing, speaks to what it means to inhabit an extractive zone, not as its victim, but as an agent of its transformation. From Hurston's ground thoughts to Césaire's plante to Berthet's plante mère, here we see a tradition of vegetal thinking that takes the plant not as a symbol of passivity, but as a model for a different relation to time, to ground, to the chemical commons of contaminated soil. But plants aren't the only beings in the ground that have something to teach us. They too are waging their own wars, and in some cases their beef is with this being here, the beetle. I'm going to take you to 2015, to Martinique, so imagine. It's the cool, dry season of mid-carême, and I'm sitting in the living room of a man I call Louis, a retired banana plantation worker who lives in northwestern Martinique. The house was modest and immaculate, set back from the road on a plot of land where Louis still kept his garden. Yams, dachine, Christophine, the root vegetables and climbing squashes that constitute the Creole provision ground. This was the same land on which he had worked for decades, the same soil into which he had poured the pesticide I work on and think about, chloricone, by hand, working the white powder into the earth at the base of each banana plant to kill this guy, the banana borer weevil. Louis had prostate cancer. He had lost, as he put it quietly, his sexually intimate life with his wife. His body and the beetle's body had been shaped by the same chemical apparatus. And part of what the chemical did to the beetle was kept it from reproducing. After offering me a cool drink and asking after the health of the friend we shared in common, Louis sat me down and handed me a plastic container, a pheromone trap, the new mode of weevil control and use on the plantation where he had been responsible for spreading chlordicone. So in the wake of chemical amendment, they're using this new thing. We talked for hours about his life as a laborer, about the chemical amendments he had applied over the years, about the consequences of his own exposures. He told me many things that afternoon. But the thing I've not been able to put down is what he told me about the beetles. When the plantation transitioned from chlordacone to pheromone traps, workers would dump the trapped beetles far from the fields and set them on fire. He showed me beetles in a trap. He's like, we'd throw them on this grate and we'd set them all on fire. But the beetles didn't burn. They do this funny thing, Louis said. And here his voice shifted, carrying something between admiration and exasperation. When you go to burn them, they group up together like a ball, like a disco ball. And when you think you've killed them, you haven't. You've only killed the ones on the outside. The ones on the inside hide beneath their comrades, and then later they eat their way out. You can't let them get together, he told me, because some will sacrifice for the others. The banana borer weevil did not choose the Caribbean. Like the enslaved people who worked the plantation, it arrived as cargo, a stowaway and infested planting material transported along the same trade routes that carried human beings, sugar, and the banana itself across the Atlantic. Its Linnaean name is Cosmopolite Sordidus, the dirty cosmopolitan, the squalid world citizen, a name that encodes the colonial imaginary's capacity to frame displacement as degradation, right? Okay, it's like, all right. And is not alone in its history. Across the plantation economies of the New World, weevils have been persistent and unrelenting companions to monoculture. You'll remember the boll weevil in cotton, whose destruction of the American South's cotton economy catalyzed the Great Migration and transformed the racial geography of the United States. The silky weevil in sugarcane, and then you have the borer in bananas. These beetles are unacknowledged fellow travelers on the path of enslavement's inheritance, seeing in the cotton, cane, and banana a ready resource that makes possible their multiplication. And yet the beetle is not inherently destructive. In a diversified landscape, it is a routine participant in a functioning ecosystem. It is the plantation system, the monocrop, that transforms it from minor ecological actor into a catastrophe. In a polycultured landscape, the weevil's a participant. In a monocrop, it's an apocalypse. The difference lies not in the beetle, but in the system. The beetle tunnels through the corm of the banana plant, weakening it until it topples in the wind. And what the plantation calls destruction, the beetle enacts as a kind of ecological return. Suzanne Césaire declared that Martinican poetry shall be cannibal or shall not be. The beetles, in their own way, are cannibal, literally eating their way through the tissue that sustains the monocrop and eating their way through the charred bodies of their comrades to survive. The glyphosate study, the chlordacone in Martinique's soil, the beetle sacrificial disco ball, the bacteria in the Paranap Delta, these are not analogies. Everyone always asks me, is your work about the metaphor? I'm like, no, it's not metaphor, it's not an analogy. There are instances of a single phenomenon, the biological response of living systems to the chemical regime of extractive agriculture. So extraction, plantation, and on it, the vegetal, the beetle. I've been building toward a single claim that the subterranean life of the plantation constitutes a form of knowledge. And that brings me now to the question of extraction in a digital age. So think back to glyphosate. The chemical regime of extractive agriculture is increasingly governed by digital systems. Precision agriculture uses GPS-guided sprayers to deliver herbicides with centimeter-level accuracy. Satellite imaging monitors crop health in real time. There's a new commercial, has anyone seen this out yet? For ChatGPT about how this farmer, this new generation farmer is taking over from the family, and she fed all of her grandfather's notes into ChatGPT, and he's produced a planting schedule for her. So algorithmic models algorithmic models optimize chemical application rates. This is the extractive view at its most technically refined, and it is precisely this view that cannot see what is happening beneath the surface. The GPS does not register the bacterial mutation in the rhizosphere. The satellite cannot image the weevil tunneling through the banana corm. The algorithm does not model the centuries-long half-life of a pesticide sprayed on a landscape. The digital systems that govern extractive agriculture are systems of surface reading. They see what can be sensed from above and compute what can be optimized within the plantation's own temporal horizon. I think about this in relation to a conversation I had with the sculptor Simone Lee recently about porcelain. She pointed out to me the fact that kaolin clay, which is what we make porcelain out of, is a material component of computers and circuit boards, the same machinery that runs these precision agriculture systems. So the same earth is mined to build the digital infrastructure that governs the plantation from above and is simultaneously composing the ground in which the plantation's chemical regime is producing its own undoing from below. The digital system is made of the earth it surveils. And in a conversation, our Black Studies department at Columbia last week invited Alondra Nelson to come and talk to us about AI. So we wanted to just hear from her big brain about what was happening in our world. And Alondra observed that the rise of AI corporations bears a structural resemblance to earlier world historical moments in which private entities achieved quasi-sovereign power over territory, labor, and the flows of extraction. She said to us, think the East India Company, think United Fruit, think Dole. These were not merely businesses, they were political formations that governed land, moved populations, toppled governments, and organized the conditions of life and death across entire regions in the service of commodity extraction. The AI corporations that now govern the digital infrastructure of precision agriculture, and increasingly the infrastructure of thought itself, are inheriting that structural position. The plantation and the platform are not analogous, they are genealogically continuous. And yet the dominant response to the crises that extractive capitalism has produced is to reach for more computation, not less. I've been struck by the faith, increasingly prevalent in both Silicon Valley, in certain strands of environmental discourse, and in the university itself, that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer will solve the problems that extraction has wrought, that we will compute our way out of contamination or out of climate change. I've newly been calling this in my head the Paradise Fantasy, and I mean the reference literally. Has anyone in here been watching the Hulu series Paradise? Okay, just a couple of you? Okay, it's very good. But if you're not caught up, put your fingers in your ears, because I'm about to give you a spoiler. So the show's second season has just revealed that its central mystery, this mysterious Alex that everyone has been searching for, is an AI-powered quantum supercomputer built with nearly unlimited resources by a tech billionaire, capable of solving in seconds problems that would take traditional supercomputers the age of the universe to solve. And the computer's mission is to reverse the climate apocalypse, possibly by manipulating time itself. And this is a show in which a tech billionaire builds an underground bunker for 25,000 people to ride out ecological collapse. And the great hope is that a quantum computer funded by her limitless capital will reset the world. It is, in other words, a show about the political and imaginative faith that our civilization is currently placing in computation as salvation, a faith so deep that we are willing to prioritize the energy budgets, the mineral extraction, the infrastructure required to build these machines over the slower, less spectacular work of actually changing how we relate to the ground. The Paradise Fantasy is the dream that technology will deliver us from the consequences of technology. Is the extractive view's final move, I would argue. The promise that the same gaze that produced the crisis can, if sufficiently accelerated, restore it. Or resolve it, excuse me. And so I think the Vegetal has something urgent to say to this project of computational acceleration. And here I'm going to mark a shift in my own language. Throughout this talk, I've been talking mostly about the vegetal, a noun, a domain, a category of life. But what I'm reaching for now is something closer to vegetality, a state of being, a condition, a mode of inhabiting time. Not the plant as object of study, but the plant as model for a different relation to duration, to patience, to the slow accumulation of response. The vegetal is what we look at. Vegetality is what plant life does. So we're living through a period in which computational systems increasingly perform the labor of thought, generating text, synthesizing arguments, producing what passes for content at speeds that render human cognitive labor comparatively glacial. And glacial was in there before I was here. I am an anthropologist by training, and the labor of my discipline is slow by design. Years of field work, the patient accumulation of trust, the gradual emergence of understanding through sustained presence at a place. And this labor is now being simulated, not replicated, but simulated by systems that can produce plausible sounding analysis in seconds. The question I want to ask is this: what does vegetality offer as a countertemporality to the accelerationist logics of both colonial extraction and computational capitalism? What remains when the quick work of the brain is no longer exclusively ours? If our brain's work is being supplanted, perhaps what we need is not a faster or more competitive human cognition, but a different relation to thinking altogether, one that takes its cue from the plant, from the slow accretion of growth, from the patient chemical negotiations between root and soil, from the phototropic turning toward light that happens at a pace no algorithm can optimize. And from this angle of vision, Suzanne Césaire's Plante begins to look less like a relic of mid-century vitalism, which we could think of it as, and more like a prophetic figure for our own moment, a moment in which the question of what the human contributes once the labor of thought has been automated leads us back to the body, to the senses, to the skin's porosity, and to the slow vegetative processes that subtend but never reduce to cognition. The vegetal is not a slower version of computation. It is a fundamentally different relation to time, organized around growth rather than output, chemical negotiation rather than optimization, the rhythms of seasons rather than the rhythms of server cycles. Rob Nixon has given us slow violence to name the incremental harm of toxic exposure. And I think that what vegetality might add is not only a description of how slowly violence operates, but a model for how slowly we might respond to that kind of violence. The beetle does not counter the plantation at the plantation speed. The bacterium does not mutate on the news cycle schedule. These are organisms that endure, that persist under conditions of chemical saturation, that adapt across generations. Julie Livingston's concept of self-devouring growth describes the plantation, a system that consumes the conditions of its own future. But the organisms that inhabit the plantation are practicing something different, not self-devouring growth, but self-sustaining endurance, the patient labor of remaining alive in a system designed for their elimination. I mean, immediately after I wrote that paragraph, I said, we don't die, we multiply. For people of a certain age, we can fully reduce my argument to Bebe's kids. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. And so the vegetal says otherwise. I'm rounding it up now, I promise, I'm almost done. The vegetal says otherwise, the beetle says otherwise, the bacteria mutating in the Paraná Delta say otherwise. What these organisms know, what they're teaching us, if we slow down enough to attend to them, is that the answer to extractive agriculture is not a better extraction, but a different relation to the ground. Not faster computation, but slower attention. Not the optimization of the monocrop, but its undoing. In an essay that that's soon to be published, I assert we get free with the weevil. What would it mean to take the banana borer weevil's destruction of the monocrop not as a pest management problem, but as a model? Not destruction for its own sake, but the slow subterranean work of undermining a system that has made itself appear permanent and inevitable. The beetle burrows from within, weakening the root system until the plant topples under its own weight. This is something closer to Suzanne Césaire's cannibalism, the consumption and transformation of what has been imposed into something that nourishes rather than destroys. And so I want to return in closing to the phrase ground wars and to its double meaning. The wars being waged in the ground, by bacteria becoming resistant, by beetles eating their way through the monocrop, by plant roots pushing through contaminated soil, are not wars that will be won or lost on any timeline that fits a news cycle or a policy horizon. They are wars of endurance fought at vegetal speed across durations that the plantation's managers cannot govern and that the plantation's digital infrastructure cannot compute. The ground does not operate on our schedule. It does not optimize. It does not accelerate. It persists. And the wars being waged over the ground, over who controls the soil, who eats from it, who carries its chemicals in their blood, are not separate from those subterranean conflicts, but continuous with them. Louis' prostate cancer, the beetle's sacrificial disco ball are products of the same chemical apparatus. The superbug mutating in the Paraná Delta and the farmer who sprayed the field that produced it are kin by shared molecular substance. The wars in the ground and the wars over the ground are, in the end, one war. And it is a war that the extractive view, whether it takes the form of the colonial surveyor's map or the precision agriculture algorithm, ooh, that's a bad phrase, I should never write that again, has never been able to see in its entirety because it has always looked from above. So what terrestrial knowledge offers, what the plant, the beetle, and the bacterium are teaching us, if we are willing to slow down enough to learn, is that the ground is not a passive substrate awaiting extraction. It is a living system with its own intelligence, its own memory, its own capacity for response. As I said before, it remembers what we put in it. And it is already, quietly, persistently, at vegetal speed, waging its own war. The question for us, for those of us who study extraction, who inhabit extractive zones, who carry the plantation's chemistry in our tissues, is not whether to join that war. We're already in it. The question is whether we can learn to fight it at the ground's own pace, slowly, collectively, and in a mode that might deserve the name vegetality. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that was coming to mind during your marvelous talk is your framing of, and I'm going to start more so with the middle, of the benedict evil as a kind of organism that tunnels from within, disrupting, weakening, and ultimately unsettling the structures it inhabits. And in my own work, I'm also thinking about how Black writers, culture producers leverage the environment, everything from cold weather to what let's just call pestilous life, to think about what it means to also, on the one hand, rethink the very category of sacrifice, right? Not just sacrifice zones, but also sacrifice bodies, right? And who's made to do that work. But how also toxins and exposure get mapped on the flesh, right? And so I'm kind of especially interested in how contamination renders the body porous, how toxin seeps through, how that porosity, and which you also talked about and gave us, forces us to rethink embodiment in the afterlives of colonialism and plantation slavery. And I found myself thinking about the figure of the Boivo, and particularly in relationship to a longer tradition of Black thought, Black radical thought, and particularly Black feminism, that takes serious how we might think about pestilous life in particular. And I'm also thinking about actually Audre Lorde's work, The Brown Menace, of course, the figure of the roach, right, as that which actually very much blurs the line between inside, outside, domesticity, right, corrupts, right, the infrastructure from within, collapsing, right, even how one thinks about sanitation, cleanliness, et cetera. But I'm also teaching, of course, right now, Richard Wright's work, and the figure of the rat, in particular, in his work on Native Son, Thomas, right? And I wonder how you might also think about the figure at the level of the limits, that it marks the limits of the system that tried to eradicate it. Right. And so I guess my question is more so, what do we do with the temporality? I think you talk about the vegetal, right? The temporality of the vegetal. But what do we do with the temporality of the Boivo, right? Particularly as this kind of disruption to racial capitalism, as a disruption to normative time, the inside, outside, the submerge, right? And I come from a family of Black farmers who are constantly thinking about, right, infestations, crop infestations, right, as a disruption to the larger economy, obviously, but also as one that seeps through the cracks of the plantation, right? And so I wonder if you could maybe talk about the temporality of it as a figure in particular, and what is it doing at the level of the vegetal? And then I have some other questions too.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. Great set of coordinates to move in and through. I mean, it's interesting, right? As I was writing this, I kept landing on the plant and not on the beetle, right? There's more thinking that I could do about the weevil, and I'll say I resisted in anthropology the way that the kind of more than human ecologies conversation unfolded was just. So I resisted for so long. I was like, I'm not doing it. Right. I refuse. I'm not doing it. I was like, sand, soil, sediment. I'm going to talk about those things, but I'm not going into the insects, et cetera. But this conversation with Louis really changed my mind, right? Like the queer icon par excellence is the disco ball, right? So when he said that the weevils formed a disco ball, I was like, well, here I go. I'm going to have to write about the weevils. Right. I think what the weevils offer us is actually something quite interesting in terms of its their, what I mean. I don't want to insist that the weevils have a sense of this kind of temporal horizon, but the sacrificial logic of the weevil is one that like really thinks about the longue durée, right? So some of us will sacrifice such that others can persist, right? That there's a really beautiful kind of understanding of collective inheritance, I think, collective adaptation and survival that is being invoked in its strategies for resisting eradication. And I think one of the things I've been trying to write and think more about are the ways that we become joined across lines of human and non-human life by our common exposures. So thinking about what I've been calling chemical kinship or chemical intimacies. And I think that's another kind of disruption of both ideas about bodily sovereignty and of ideas about kind of timescales that we are able to control. So the pesticide, for example, that I work on takes 600 years to break down naturally. Naturally, I mean, whatever. It would take 600 years for it to kind of dissipate in the soil and the groundwater of the island of Martinique. And so it's in people's bodies. It's in the bodies as they reproduce more people, right? Like it's a presence on a time scale that humans are unable to even compute. So I think the weevil enters into that temporality in interesting ways. So thank you.
And thank you for that. That's really remarkable. And I also really love your formulation of where you thought of ecological return of where actually the breaking down is actually the return back to the soil, right? And that is actually in terms of thinking just futurity from in regards to that. I also wanted to say something about your marvelous kind of thinking with Martinique, of course, and I was also thinking about Martinique as also the space of abstraction, but also the site of paradise, right? And you actually talked quite extensively and beautifully, right, about the undoing of paradise from the extractive view, right, where computational kind of like analysis wants to imagine a kind of paradise that you said we could compute our way, right, to having to do the kind of strenuous work that it supposedly offers as its own promise of paradise itself. And I guess I'm just curious how you're also thinking about like toxicity and also Martinique and the kind of figure of paradise itself as tied to the landscape and what that might also do to just like the way we have often thought about, say, the site of, leisure and also work, et cetera, for those who are a part of this tourist economy, obviously.
So that's a great question too. Thank you. And it's so funny. I haven't yet in my own head been able to thread the needle, or I haven't even tried to, between the TV show Paradise and Martinique in Paradise. But I'm like, ooh, that's an interesting. I'll get there, but I'm not there yet. Maybe there's I think there's a way. Well, I mean, there is a way actually. The TV show Paradise is about this construction of a bunker to get us out of ecological collapse. And it's about kind of the making of a laboratory for the reinvention of the social at the moment when the world or when the earth can no longer support human life. And there's a way that Martinique has long been framed as a kind of laboratory for the elaboration of colonial fantasies in the Caribbean. Martinique is unusual compared to other sites in the region because it is still French, it is European. It's like the other non-sovereign spaces in the region, like Puerto Rico, like Guadeloupe, like French Guiana, Guyane. Like the ABCs that have differential relationships, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. So there's a way that the paradise fantasy for that island operates almost entirely within its own imperial zone, which is very different from the way that the kind of fantasy of Caribbean paradise operates in other parts of the region. Martinique is, Martinique can say with great pride, in other islands, I have to get this right, tourists live like kings and the people suffer. And here we have the opposite. People live like kings in scare quotes, because of the resources of the French state, because of things like access to EU citizenship, the ability to move if you have enough capital. There's a civic and a kind of municipal infrastructure that you don't see in other islands. And the tourism industry is fairly anemic compared to places like Barbados, where my family is from, that have been completely overtaken by the hotel and tourism industry. And so it's a particular what I'm trying to say, I think, is it's a particular kind of paradise, right? Vision of how that colonial relation unfolds. And you asked about its relationship to toxicity and landscape. Well, I think that the thing that one of the things that catalyzed the response to the pesticide contamination on Martinique was that it was 2002, I believe. I may be getting this date wrong, but a shipment of sweet potatoes gets sent from Martinique up to Dunkirk, which is where all of those sweet potatoes get kind of welcomed into the kind of commodity circuits of mainland France. And when they get to Dunkirk, they do their usual testing for, various kinds of kind of chemical amendment. And they're found to be way too full of pesticide to be consumed safely by humans. And so these sweet potatoes are burned as soon as they arrive in Dunkirk. And people in Martinique are watching this happen and saying, well, we send only the best of what come off the plantation up to mainland France. The rest actually stays here in local markets for consumption. Is that me? Good. Okay. I was like, oh no. And so there's a recognition then that we are both the sink for your fantasies about Caribbean paradise and the sink for your kind of toxic materials.
And I am thank you for that. I was also struck by Louis, is that the name? And also, I think you also said, as someone who was living with cancer, right? Talk about slow death, right? Talk about agricultural time and plantation time and the toll it have on bodies. And I constantly think about it in my own work, particularly the toxic materialities of Black bodies made to bear, right? And become the actual sacrificial kind of, subjects of agricultural, monocultural production. And so I guess I wanted you maybe to say, how does one think about scale, right? Moving from both the toxicity of the environment to think about also the toxicity of it having on the flesh and moving into the pores. And what does it mean for particularly even Louis itself to come to terms with that, right? As both retired on one hand, but also living with cancer on the other, right? There seems to be, and I'm just thinking of, the state of retirement is supposed to be the time of one's life where you actually slow down and, but also enjoy the fruit of one's labor. And at the same time, the ways in which cancer is also deeply given him a different sense of time and also a sense of his own relationship to the landscape and the work that he did.
That's a great question, one that we should go down there and pose to him. In some ways, I mean, the first thing it made me think of before Louis, in some ways, is that Louis is in terms of the folks that I got to know on the island, is a bit of an outlier in that he gets diagnosed with prostate cancer in his, I'm gonna say, early 60s. And what's happening on the island is that you have very large cancer clusters of people with prostate, ovarian, uterine cancers happening in their 30s and their 40s. And like the relationship to kind of even how we think about the time when one expects a diagnosis of this sort has completely shifted on the island, both in the hospital infrastructures and in people's kind of ongoing and everyday kind of thinking about their bodies. And so, like, for example, one conversation that was circulating was about, the invocation, at least in Anglophone, much of Anglophone healthcare, is that you start getting prostate cancer, colonoscopies. I'm like, what is the exam? In your mid 40s. And that instead, like the temporality of that, even that exam recommendation has moved now to your 20s and early 30s on the island because of the prevalence and the desire to catch these things early. So the relationship to kind of time and the threat or the horizon of fatal disease has shifted, I think, in important ways. And you also asked about scale, and I'm not sure.
Or just how do you think about, think about the toxicity that actually, that is almost invisible, right, below the surface. And I think one of the things you actually says that I really love is also, what does it mean to, and maybe this is just, I'm teaching a class on bottom ecologies, right? And so I'm really thinking about how one views, right, from what position, and also the duration of what it means to stay slow, or for that matter, stay with or tend to, right? And that requires a level of attention of slowing down, as you said, right? And so what does that require of one, right? I'm just thinking at the level of methodology. If you could say more about that too.
The slowdown. The slowdown. Yeah, sure. I first started writing and thinking about this ground stuff in a talk I gave years ago in 2022 called Gone to Ground. And it was just kind of at the tail end of the most acute phase of COVID lockdown, right? And it was one of the first big gatherings I'd gone to kind of in the wake. And everybody's, kind of rushing back into their pre-COVID temporalities, right? Yeah. And I was like, wait, we need to actually slow down. Because I think there was something really generative about that slowing. And so I was thinking about a couple of different things. One was that Tiffany Lethabo King had actually asked a group of us what we'd been doing during that time. And some people had things to say about all the books they were writing and all the things they were doing, and others of us were like, I just gathered the closest circles of my people and we went to ground. We just locked it down and tried to get through. And so I was trying to think about what that period was for me and what it might teach us about the possibilities for efflorescence on the other side, or the possibilities for kind of deeper thinking, slower relating. And I'm not trying to get into that whole early 90s slow food, slow blah blah blah, I'm not trying to go there, but I'm interested in what happens when we slow down. I have a child who has a condition that requires a lot of downtime and a lot of slowing down and a lot of being still and a lot of not moving. I had an aunt who was verging on a vegetative state for a long time, and so I was trying to think about all of these I was trying to think about the genius still alive in those states, and about the kind of what we can learn from it. And there's this beautiful, Audre Lorde has this gorgeous poem called Martha, and it's about a former lover of hers who's close to death and who's in a vegetative state. You can just see in her eyes a twinkle of life. But Martha's with us, and she's thinking with us still. And I was really curious about, how can we, I think the way that some people would say this is mine this for resources. No, that's not what I'm how can we think alongside of these states of being and ways of being in not even necessarily in capitalist productive ways, but in ways that feel nourishing and that feel that they might point us somewhere. And so that's where a lot of that came from for me. And continues to inform my thinking now about the vegetal and about what it can teach us.
Yeah.